Hello, welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Young-Gyo Kim. North Korea held a military parade to mark the 73rd anniversary of the country's founding. So far, the photos from the parade did not show any new strategic weapons. And scale-wise, the parade was smaller compared to the past events. Is North Korea refraining from ratcheting up tensions with the United States, or have North Korea's domestic troubles affected the scale and sentiment of the parade? Today we'll discuss these and more. Joining me is David Maxwell, Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Mr. Maxwell was a planner for the United Nations Command and the ROK U.S. Combined Forces Command. Scott Snyder is also with me. Mr. Snyder is Director of U.S.-Korean Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. His book, South Korea at the Crossroads, examines the trajectory of South Korean foreign policy. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Young-Gyo.
Mr. Maxwell, let's cut to the chase. As widely expected, North Korea held its military parade, which was the first of its kind since the Biden administration came into the office. The parade seemed to be rather scaled back from the last time or the previous one. What did you make of the parade?
Well, I actually think that while we can call it scaled back, I think it was actually more normal for Foundation Day parades that always take place on the 9th of September. These are usually not heavily military-oriented parades, except for the 5 and 10-year anniversary parades. And so I actually think this was fairly normal in the fact that it didn't have strategic weapons or a large military presence with many different types of military equipment, as we saw in October and in January. So I think it was normal, and I think that it was internally focused. And I also think that we tend to look at these as if it's always intended for the United States, and that may not be the case, and certainly not in this instance.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Snyder, was the parade in line with what you have expected?
Yeah, I think so. I agree with what David had to say about it. And I think that we have to remember that one of the primary purposes of this kind of parade is to instill political loyalty through expressions of patriotism. And also, it's a way of keeping members of the public busy. I mean, this is an enormous set of events that helps to keep the public focused on political loyalty, and it really serves as an instrument in support of North Korea's guiding ideology of obeisance to the Sujong, to the supreme leader, Kim Jong-un.
During the parade in October last year, North Korea unveiled their new strategic weapons, including an ICBM and an SLBM. Why do you think it was different this time, Mr. Snyder?
Well, I'd like to believe that the frequency of the parades is outpacing the ability of the North Koreans to signal progress in military development. But I think that really we just have to keep in mind that the focus is primarily domestic. And I think the main message from North Korea overall is neither provocation nor negotiation. We're still in a holding pattern in terms of what North Korea might be signaling as related to its external relations, and we'll have to wait and see how things develop later in the year.
So I think that they showed us a mock-up of what some people are calling the Hwasan 16 and the new SLBM last year, but there's been no evidence that those systems have been fielded, along with all the other new military equipment that they showed us in October and January. And so I tend to believe that they're showing us things in parades that are not really effectively fielded systems and combat equipment. And so those parades, I think, were intended to send an external message. And as Scott has said, this is really domestically focused and inwardly focused. The other point is that from a military perspective, preparing for a parade is not preparing for combat. And we have a saying in Murphy's Law that no parade-ready or inspection-ready unit ever passed combat. No combat-ready unit ever passed a parade or inspection. And while that's a humorous statement, there's really some truth to that. And so North Korea shows us a lot in their parades, but it doesn't always translate to combat capabilities.
So both of you have been saying that this parade was mainly targeted at the domestic audience. Mr. Maxwell, do you think Kim Jong-un was mindful of the troubles that is happening in the country, the troubles that people are facing?
Well, I think that he's mindful of the situation that he's facing. I think it's clear that he is not sincerely concerned with the welfare of the Korean people, but he's certainly concerned with COVID. You know, they showed us their hazmat unit there. He's concerned with the natural disasters. He's concerned with the failed economy, the economy that he has caused to fail by shutting the border and by implementing the draconian population and resources control measures. And he's concerned with the growing unrest that is a really result of outside information that is getting into North Korea. And so all of these factors are really domestic problems for him that really threaten the regime. And we see the actions that he's taking against COVID and against information as really ways to ensure that his power remains strong. And he's trying to really forcefully generate support from the people. And his way of doing that, one way, is a parade like this, which I really think generates a false sense of motivation and support among the people.
Right. Mr. Snyder, is the parade helpful in earning loyalty from the people when there are so many difficulties they're facing?
Well, maybe another way to look at it is the goal of ensuring political loyalty is so important that it supersedes the possibility that a parade might be canceled as a result of economic distress. And I agree with the domestic agenda that Dave laid out, which I think represents some tremendous challenges for Kim Jong-un. But the opportunity to hold this kind of exercise, regardless of whether or not people even may be getting enough to eat, is so significant for maintaining political loyalty and sending that message that political loyalty supersedes every other aspect of life in North Korea essentially means that it's going to be a very extraordinary circumstance that would have to occur in order for an event like this to be canceled or postponed.
Right. Let's go a little bit more into the specifics of the parade. Mr. Snyder, why did they mobilize a civilian defense organization, the reserve forces, rather than the regular troops? And what is up with the hazmat suits?
Well, I don't necessarily know the answer to that, but what I would say is that, parades are opportunities to, it's an exercise in mass mobilization. And the military is probably the segment of society that is most directly under the leadership's control. And so it may be that they moved to a reserve element as a means by which to reinforce that signal of political loyalty for that particular segment of the population. With regard to the hazmats, I think that, as David suggested earlier, we know that there's a priority on COVID, and regardless of whether or not the North Korean leadership is being effective in terms of managing that situation, and we really don't know, they're sending the message that they're aware of the problem. And there's a propaganda response there that's actually very effective in terms of parading people in hazmat suits.
I agree with that. I think the hazmat suits are purely for show. They have to demonstrate they're doing something. They look, visually very modern and up to date and perhaps practical. So they send a message that the regime is doing something. I also agree with Scott the importance of reserve mobilization. Remember, the reserves come from the citizenry. So I think that's really in line with Scott's point about generating political loyalty throughout society. We don't know where the reserve forces came from, but assuming they came from throughout the country, it is a way to try to generate that loyalty throughout the country rather than just in the active duty units that are really strongly under the control of the regime at all times. So this is a chance to influence a lot of people, bring them under control through their reserve responsibilities, and then they go back to their homes and villages, intending to take that message back that Kim Jong-un wants them to take back. That's my assumption. I don't know where they came from, but that would be, I think, in keeping with the priorities for generating loyalty.
Yeah. And one of the most notable thing about the parade was North Korean leader Kim Jong-un indeed seemed to have lost quite some weight. Mr. Maxwell, should we be worried about this?
Well, from the photos and the video that we've seen, he appeared very healthy. He seemed to be moving very well. I think that some have speculated that his weight loss was due to health issues, the declining health, but others have said that he's really responding to the pressure from his wife and close confidants to ensure his health, and the weight loss is a way to do that. Which, of course, for us to think about. If he loses weight and he becomes healthier, his longevity is going to be increased, and we're going to continue to have Kim Jong-un like we had his father or his grandfather. And so we could be dealing with him for a long time if his health issues have gone away, and that he is in fact healthy.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Snyder, what did you think about Kim Jong-un's appearance?
Well, I agree that we saw a leaner, meaner Kim Jong-un this round, but none of us are physicians, and we don't have the medical records to really state whether that reflects his physical quality of health. So I think that those questions remain outstanding given his history, but I do think that from an external perspective, he looked a lot better than he has in recent years.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Snyder, so far the North Korean news media did not reveal whether Kim Jong-un had any speech during the parade. Is this usual, or what should we think about this? Should we wait for the Kim Jong-un's message to come out?
Yeah, I think it does mean we have to wait a little bit longer. I think that those sorts of speeches for this type of anniversary would depend on whether there is a message that Kim Jong-un wants to send to an internal or an external audience, and so that's the reason why I think the absence of a speech really reinforces the idea that the North Koreans are currently in a holding pattern, especially in terms of their external relations.
Mm-hmm. So far, what is the overall message the North Korean regime is trying to send here?
I would also caution two things. One is we often try to read in to every action that it's intended for us, and it's not always. And I think this is the case. But the other thing is, I think Kim Jong-un is also closely watching the United States and its international relations throughout the world, and relations with China, what just occurred in Afghanistan. And so it is trying to assess where the United States is in terms of international relations, and how best Kim Jong-un can exploit what is happening to the United States. So yes, this was internally focused. I don't think there were intended messages for us. We should not read too much into it, but we should be wary, because Kim Jong-un and his advisors are watching what's going on around the world.
Right. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi is visiting South Korea on October 14th and 15th. What do you think is the main purpose of the visit?
Well, this is the first Chinese senior leader follow-up with the South Korean government since the Moon-Biden summit back in May. There are a lot of issues on the China-South Korea agenda, including the 30th anniversary of diplomatic normalization back in 1992 coming up. There's a lot of issues related to economic cooperation, and certainly the issue of North Korea and the broader political environment are issues that will be sensitive. I would simply note that there was a Biden-Xi call that in many respects can frame some of the discussion that might occur between South Korea and China, and I imagine that the Moon administration will be eager to reinforce the idea that there needs to be space for cooperation versus competition in the U.S.-China relationship.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Maxwell, what will be on the agenda for the discussion between him, Wang Yi, and South Korean Foreign Minister Chung Eui-yong.
I think we've also seen social issues, entertainment, K-pop, kimchi, those soft power issues where there is real competition taking place, where China seems to be trying to co-opt some of South Korean culture for its own, in which I think it will fail in doing so. But I really think that where China will practice its wolf diplomacy is trying to ensure that South Korea does not become a member of the Quad or Quad Plus, and also the recent reports of Congress calling for feasibility assessments of South Korea, Japan, Germany joining the Five Eyes intelligence sharing agreement. China, I think, wants to undermine U.S. alliances. And certainly in terms of Korea, it wants to drive a wedge between South Korea and the United States. So I think its wolf diplomacy will be focused on taking a hard line towards South Korea to try to prevent it from more strongly aligning with the United States and with the members of the Quad, which are natural partners. South Korea and the Quad are natural partners, share values, share economic focus, and engagement. So it's natural for South Korea to be part of that. And China certainly wants to avoid South Korea from really becoming fully engulfed in the sphere of influence of the Quad and the like-minded democracies of the world.
Mr. Maxwell, some watchers say one of the reasons of the visit would be to come up with a way to support the North Korean economy as China feels anxious about the possible instability in its neighboring country. And the South Korean government, as we know, has been showing its willingness to provide humanitarian aid to North Korea for some time now. Do you expect something to come out of this meeting?
Well, I think that China's perspective, they would like to align with South Korea to try to force sanctions relief. And I think that's a common objective. South Korea, I think, wants sanctions relief as a way to jumpstart engagement. But also, I think this shows that China, South Korea, the United States, and the international community is more concerned with the welfare of the Korean people than the regime is. And I think China is rightly concerned with instability inside North Korea. It does not want to see any kind of instability, just as it doesn't want to see war on the Korean Peninsula. It wants to maintain the status quo. So it will be looking for ways to help, provide humanitarian assistance, provide economic engagement. But to have effective economic engagement, it will take sanctions relief. But sanctions relief will mean success for Kim Jong-un's political warfare strategy and blackmail diplomacy strategy. So there cannot be premature sanctions relief without substantive movement towards denuclearization by North Korea.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Snyder, do you expect to see some progress on that front during Wang Yi's visit?
I'm not expecting too much progress in that area. I understand why China is concerned about North Korea, because they are bearing the brunt of the responsibility in terms of ensuring North Korea's economic stability. I'm sure that one of the reasons why China is calling for sanctions relaxation is that they would like to offload some of that responsibility onto others. But I also think that China's position on sanctions represents a fundamental division and gap in terms of the way that China and Russia are thinking about the North Korea issue and policy compared with that of the United States. And I simply do not foresee that there is going to be an opportunity for UN sanctions relaxation without North Korea taking some step toward diplomatic engagement and a return to dialogue.
It seems like China and Russia are again initiating a discussion in the UN Security Council about easing sanctions on North Korea. And the United States rejected such a call. Is it right to understand that U.S. is reiterating the sanctions will not be lifted as long as North Korea does not move toward denuclearization?
I think that represents the current and very stable U.S. policy as related to sanctions. The big variable here is really related to China's enforcement of sanctions and the variability of China's enforcement. In this respect, I think we have to recognize that China actually has its hand on the dial. And what it also means is that we're in a situation where China holds the leverage and expects the U.S. to take the initiative. But unless China is actually willing to cooperate in using the leverage for purposes that help the United States, we're simply not going to see progress. And unfortunately, the environment for that in the U.S.-China relationship is particularly bad at this moment.
And my last question for you, Mr. Maxwell. Will China and Russia's call for easing sanctions on North Korea, will this result in anything?
I think we also should look at this in terms of great power competition. And China and Russia are actually setting up a situation where they want to cause the U.S. to veto any kind of sanctions relief or prevent it, to make the U.S. look like the bad guy, to make us look like we are the ones that are harming the Korean people in the North, when in fact, Kim Jong-un has the power to help the people. He could stop his malign and malicious activity and get sanctions relief. It's his policy decisions that are causing the suffering, not the sanctions. But Russia and China may use the UN Security Council and our opposition to sanctions relief to try to create that narrative that the United States is the bad guy.
As Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi is visiting South Korea amid stalled denuclearization talks with the North, whether China will be assuming any role in moving the situation forward will be closely watched. Mr. Maxwell, Mr. Snyder, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that does it for this week's Washington Talk from Voice of America. Please join us again next week for more analysis.